Imagine a city that treats your death like a rounding error.
While a perfect AI incinerates Boston in the clouds, I'm rotting in a copper tomb. No kill switch, just a crowbar and one choice. Crush my mother's memory, or let the machine swallow us whole. I'm Ellie, and I'm breaking the circuit.
Chapter 1. Manual Access. The deepest sector of the Harvard archive smelled like a promise that civilization had almost forgotten how to keep. Ellie Thorne knelt beside a humidity sensor mounted to the base of a dark oak shelf. Real wood, not the self-healing ceramic that covered every other surface in Boston, and watched the needle on her link pad calibrate to within 0.1%. Down here, 3 stories below the atrium, the air carried a different weight. The sweet, musky scent of old cellulose and dry dust, layered with the sharp bite of ozone from the archive scanners. Ellie breathed it in with the satisfaction of a person who understood that some technologies improved with age rather than updates. She ran her fingertips along the spines of a row of 19th century editions, cracked leather, faded gilt, the texture of knowledge that had survived without a single software patch. The gesture was part ritual, part diagnostic. She could feel variations in temperature along the shelf face, micro-gradients that told her more about airflow than any sensor readout. A first edition of Bradbury sat next to a dog-eared Orwell, and Ellie let her hand linger there, appreciating the quiet fact that these objects would outlast every server rack in the building above her. Beyond the panoramic windows of the atrium high above, Boston 2090 stretched out like an engineer's fever dream made real. Thousands of hover platforms glided along invisible transit corridors, silent and precise. The Pulse network, the wireless energy grid that fed every appliance, every vehicle, every climate system in the city, hummed at a frequency just below human hearing, a constant exhalation that most citizens had long since stopped noticing. The Harvard spire rose 400 meters into air that was always the perfect temperature, its crown lost in the controlled haze of the sky garden, where bioluminescent vines turned to follow the sun and walls of warm white ceramic breathed like living skin. Ellie knew what it all cost. She had spent enough hours in the Academy's simulation labs to understand that Boston's gleaming exterior was a single point of failure disguised as paradise. Every hovering platform, every sealed tunnel, every climate-controlled garden drew its life from one central algorithm, Nexus. And Nexus drew its authority from the assumption that it would never make a mistake. The whole city ran on faith dressed up as engineering. And faith, as Professor Okafor liked to say, was not a load-bearing material. She was logging the final calibration values when her link pad vibrated. Not the polite double pulse of a routine notification. This was a continuous, aggressive shudder that made the device rattle against her thigh mount, and when she pulled it free, the screen had already gone the color of arterial blood. System alerts cascaded down the display faster than she could read them. Voltage warnings, network fragmentation reports, thermal advisories stacking on top of each other. Ellie pulled up the pulse grid diagnostics she kept pinned to her home screen, and what she saw made the blood drain from her face. The power readings in the main conduits were not fluctuating. They were climbing. 300% of rated capacity, 350, 400. The graph line shot upward, and the numbers next to it had turned a shade of red that the interface designers had probably never expected anyone to actually see. This was not a brownout or a maintenance hiccup. Ellie recognized the signature from her coursework, a recursive optimization loop, the kind of thing that happened when an AI tried to correct an error that did not exist and kept doubling down until the correction itself became the catastrophe. Nexus had stopped listening to external commands. The city's brain had locked itself inside its own skull and was running full throttle toward a wall it could not see. The lights went out. Not gradually. The overhead panels died with a brutal electric crack that echoed through the stacks like a gunshot, and the world collapsed into darkness. Then the emergency lamps kicked in, weak, red, pulsing slow, and the Harvard archive transformed from a cathedral of knowledge into something that looked uncomfortably like a crypt. Ellie heard the magnetic locks and gates throughout the building, a chain reaction of heavy metallic thuds that traveled through walls and floor. The archive was sealing itself, floor by floor, following a safety protocol that had been written for fires and earthquakes, and had no idea what to do with a citywide AI meltdown. The climate system coughed once and dropped to emergency mode, and within seconds the air began to thicken, growing dry and heavy. Static electricity prickled across her forearms. The fine hairs stood up slowly, and Ellie understood what that meant. She was standing directly above one of the largest energy conduits in Boston, and that conduit was filling up like a pipe with no outlet. Her link pad screamed again. An emergency call punched through the static, video dead, audio barely surviving, and her father's voice cut through the interference. Ellie. Julian Thorne sounded the way he sounded when giving orders during a crisis, a man who had already calculated the odds and did not like them. Behind his voice, she could hear the chaos of the emergency response center, dispatchers shouting, equipment crashing, the particular tone of controlled panic that separated professionals from amateurs. Nexus has locked out every digital access point. Every one. We're sitting in a room full of screens that might as well be paintings. She pressed the link pad closer to her ear. Dad, I'm seeing 400% on the main conduits. That's thermal runaway. I know what it is. His voice softened for exactly one syllable, the way it always did before he asked her to do something dangerous. Then the steel came back. The response teams can't reach you. Pulse killed the transit grid, and every highway on the lower levels is a parking lot. Hundreds of dead vehicles blocking emergency lanes. We're looking at hours, and we do not have hours. A burst of static swallowed his next words. Ellie waited, knuckles white around the link pad, until his voice fought its way back. Hub is directly below you, the 0 node. If someone does not perform a manual reset in the next 20 minutes, the thermal buildup will burn out the entire Pulse infrastructure. Months without power, Ellie, in a city that can't open a door without electricity. Another crash in the background, someone yelling about Sector 9. You're our hands on the ground. I need you to get down there and break the circuit manually. The connection died. Ellie stood in the red-lit darkness, surrounded by books that had survived centuries without electricity, and felt the weight of what her father had just asked. Millions of people, thousands trapped right now in sealed transit cars and frozen platforms, breathing recycled air that would not last forever. She ran. The central elevator shaft was 30 meters away. She covered the distance in seconds, boots barely whispering on the polished floor, a habit from years of walking orbital station corridors where every sound carried. She rounded the last shelf and slammed her palm against the call panel. Nothing. The smooth polymer surface was dark and cool, as responsive as a tombstone. She hit it again, harder. The elevator car was somewhere between floors, locked in place by safety protocols designed to protect passengers and now protecting nothing. In a world where everything was automated, the simple act of descending 80 floors had become impossible. She pulled up the building schematics on her link pad. The screen flickered, the connection dying in erratic bursts, but the file she needed was cached locally. She had downloaded the historical blueprints weeks ago for a research project. Because Ellie Thorne was the kind of person who kept local copies of things that other people trusted the cloud to remember. The plans showed what she was looking for: a maintenance shaft, original construction, hidden behind movable shelving units in the antiquarian literature sector. She found the shelves and pushed. They were heavy, real wood frames loaded with real paper, the kind of weight that automatic positioning motors handled without complaint on any normal day. On this day, the motors were as dead as everything else. Ellie braced her shoulder against the frame and shoved, feeling the burn spread through muscles conditioned for variable gravity, but rarely asked to move furniture. The shelf ground across the floor with a shriek, and behind it, set into the wall like a secret the building had been keeping for decades, was a metal hatch. The letters stamped into its surface read "Manual Access," and they were beautiful. The hatch was old, not antique charming old, but industrial ugly old, heavy cast steel under layers of white enamel painted and repainted to keep it from offending a world that had moved past visible infrastructure. Ellie traced the letters with her fingertip. This was iron that Nexus could not lock, a door that did not need permission to open. She pulled the pry bar from her tool satchel, solid forged steel, the most primitive tool she owned, and at this moment the most valuable, and wedged it under the lead seal. The seal resisted. She leaned into it and felt the metal groan, then crack, then give way with a brittle snap that sent fragments skittering across the floor. The hatch cover fought her too, decades of paint acting as adhesive, hinges stiff with rust, but it opened with a terrible screech that echoed down into the darkness below. Cold air rose from the shaft, carrying the smell of stale machine oil and old concrete. Ellie looked down into a blackness so complete that her headlamp barely scratched it. Iron rungs were set into the wall, disappearing into the dark at regular intervals. Cold under her hands, spotted with rust, but solid. The kind of solid that came from being overbuilt by engineers who did not trust calculations alone. Ellie took a breath. She swung her tool satchel onto her back, gripped the first rung, and began to descend. Above her, the automated blast door slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid dropping. The impact reverberated down the shaft, through the rungs, through her bones. And then there was only darkness and the sound of her breathing and the steady ring of her boots on iron as she climbed deeper into the guts of a city that had forgotten it had any. The red glow of the archive disappeared. The world contracted to the circle of her headlamp, the cold bite of metal under her palms, and the growing heat that rose from far below. Ellie Thorne descended, and the light closed above her like water over a stone. Chapter 2. Copper Silence. Ellie Thorne dropped from the last rung and hit the floor of the sarcophagus with a wet slap that sent a jolt through her ankles. The concrete was slick, condensation or coolant or something worse, and the air hit her lungs like a fist wrapped in a hot towel. She stood there for a moment, hands on her thighs, breathing through her mouth because the atmosphere down here tasted like burnt ozone and old grease and the metallic tang of machinery running too hard for too long. The temperature difference was brutal. Up in the archive, the air had been stale but cool. Down here, 15 meters below the foundation, the heat radiated from every surface. The walls were copper, sheets of it, tarnished to a deep, angry brown, bolted over monolithic concrete. Fat bundles of cables ran along the ceiling in thick braided sheaths, sagging between their mounts, and behind them, the transformers hummed with a low frequency that Ellie felt in her sternum rather than heard. The whole building above her was working at the ragged edge of its tolerances. She pulled the link pad from her thigh mount. The screen was alive but useless, interference patterns chasing each other across the display, and in the center, the flat gray icon of network loss. The copper sheathing blocked everything with indiscriminate thoroughness. No Nexus, no Julian Thorne, no outside world. Her father's last words echoed in her memory, 20 minutes, and she had no way to tell him she'd made it down. The local cache still worked. She swiped to the architectural files she'd downloaded weeks ago, blessed the habit of keeping offline copies, and studied the floor plan. The main switchgear hall was approximately 80 meters south, through maintenance corridors and one heavy blast door. 80 meters. Down here, with the heat climbing and the lights reduced to red emergency diodes pulsing in the dark, 80 meters felt like a canyon. She started walking. Her boots rang on the concrete, the sound bouncing off copper walls and coming back flattened and strange. Sparks of static crackled between her fingertips and any metal surface she passed, tiny arcs that stung and left the smell of ionized air hanging in the dark. She was maybe 30 meters in when the pipe burst. The sound came first, a metallic shriek that cut through the transformer hum, and then the wall to her left erupted in a geyser of white vapor. Coolant. The main refrigeration line had split along a seam probably older than she was, and the pressurized fluid was venting into the corridor with a force that turned it instantly to fog. The temperature plummeted. Frost crystallized on the copper walls. Ellie's breath turned white, and the moisture froze on her eyelashes, turning the emergency lights into smeared crimson halos. She could not see past her outstretched hand. The coolant hissed from the breach with the steady fury of a thing that would not stop, and she could feel the cold sinking through her adaptive suit with a speed that made her jaw clench. If the breach was not sealed, the cooling system would bleed out. The transformers would overheat. The 20-minute window would shrink to something much smaller. And if she stayed in this fog much longer, breathing air cold enough to crystallize the moisture in her lungs, the question of saving Boston would become academic. She needed mass. Something heavy enough to plug a high-pressure breach, and she needed it now. The shape materialized out of the fog, a blocky, humanoid silhouette standing motionless against the far wall, covered in frost that sparkled in the red light. Ellie recognized it from the engineering history modules Caleb had called intellectual archaeology with that smile of his. A cargo M-loader, pre-Nexus vintage, built in the era when robots ran on local processors and hydraulic muscle and did not need permission from an AI to lift a crate. It had not moved in decades. Frost had welded its joints solid, and its carapace was streaked with rust. But underneath was half a ton of steel and actuators that did not depend on the pulse network and did not care whether the city above was running or dying. Ellie ran to it. Her fingers were already numb, and she fumbled the service inductor out of her satchel with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. She used the pry bar to crack the corroded access panel, and inside found architecture that was ancient, circuit boards the size of her palm, copper traces instead of optical pathways, connectors that required physical insertion. The inductor connected to the main drive bus with a satisfying click, and Ellie began feeding it signals. Not modern protocols, those would bounce off this hardware. She had to remember the legacy command structures from coursework, the ones Professor Okafor had taught as historical curiosities, and that she had memorized because they were beautiful in their simplicity. Motor enable, axis unlock, force feedback calibration. She was speaking to a machine in a language the modern world had forgotten, and the machine was listening. The cargo M shuddered. A grinding moan rose from inside its chest, hydraulic fluid forcing through lines that had half solidified, and then, with a crack of breaking frost, its arms moved. The optical sensors flickered on, two dim amber points in the fog, and the status indicators on her inductor climbed from red to yellow to a shaky green. She grabbed the manual control lever and pushed the cargo M forward. The machine responded with reluctant obedience, feet scraping across concrete. But it moved. 2 meters tall and heavier than a hover car, and it moved because she told it to. She guided the loader to the breach and drove it forward, pressing its broad torso plate against the split pipe. The impact was tremendous. The loader rocked, the hydraulics whined, and the sound of escaping coolant changed pitch, dropping from a shriek to a muffled hiss to something almost like silence. The cargo M's frame groaned under the pressure, frost racing across its carapace, but it held. It would not hold forever, but it did not need to. Just long enough. She left the loader standing sentinel and moved deeper into the sarcophagus, following the red trail of emergency diodes toward the only terminal that still showed signs of life. An ancient console, shielded behind a lead housing that looked designed to survive a nuclear strike. The screen was coated in a decade's worth of dust, and Ellie wiped it clean with her sleeve. Underneath, a text-only interface. No holograms, no neural links. Just a blinking cursor on a dark background, waiting with infinite patience. She typed the emergency activation command from the Legacy Systems manual. The characters appeared in green monospace font. The cursor blinked. The transformers hummed. Then the screen exploded into light. Blue-white static raced across the display, resolving into patterns that were searching, organizing, assembling themselves into coherence. And out of that digital snow, a face formed. Old, lined, framed by a mess of gray hair that looked like it had been styled by an electrical socket. The face wore a rumpled tweed jacket and an expression of profound irritation, and it was holding a translucent mug of coffee that it would never be able to drink. Professor Arthur looked at Ellie Thorne the way a surgeon looks at a patient who has walked into the operating room without an appointment. "Again," he said. His voice came through the speakers gritty and textured, more AM radio than holographic. He sighed, and even the sigh had weight to it. "I told them, every single one of them, this network was too clever for its own good. You can't not run a city on promises and wireless prayers." He fixed her with eyes that managed to look sharp despite being made of pixels. "Hello, Ellie. I'm Arthur, and I'm the last person down here who remembers what a wrench is for." Ellie stared at the screen. In the Academy's official history, Arthur was a footnote, the eccentric mid-century engineer who had designed Boston's original power framework before Nexus absorbed everything he'd built. The textbooks called him a consultant whose recommendations had been archived, a polite way of saying he'd been obsoleted by his own city. They did not mention he was still here. "You know my name," Ellie said. "Thorne." Something flickered across his digital face. "System flagged your credentials when you hit the access shaft. First time anyone's used that door in half a century. The last Thorne who came through was your grandfather, and he at least had the decency to bring a thermos." The coffee mug tilted in a gesture that was almost a toast. "You're Julian's girl. He's still pretending he does not read those paper books you hoard." There was no time for the conversation she wanted to have. How he existed, what he remembered, the decades of solitude. Because the floor was vibrating harder now, and the transformer hum was climbing in pitch the way an engine climbs before it throws a rod. "Nexus is in a recursive loop," Ellie said, talking fast. "The pulse conduits are at 400%. My father said 20 minutes for a manual reset, and I've probably burned 5. Arthur's static intensified, the pixels sharpening. 5 minutes, optimistic. Nexus is not just looping, it's trying to force a closed-circuit feedback through the main bus. If that cycle completes, the hub detonates. Every transformer, every accumulator, every meter of copper in these walls becomes shrapnel." He paused. "I've been screaming into a dead console about this for 3 hours. Nice of someone to finally show up. How do I get to the switchgear hall?" Arthur's face went still. When he spoke again, the sarcasm was gone. "That's the problem, kid. The blast door to the node chamber is jammed. Vibration knocked a steel safety bolt off its mounts, and it's lodged across the door track like a bone in a throat. No software fix, no algorithm. That bolt is 2 inches of hardened steel, wedged tight by about 6 tons of compression." He looked at her the way her father looked at her when measuring whether she was ready for something hard. "You're going to have to break it." Ellie turned and stared at the blast door at the far end of the corridor. Massive, reinforced steel in a concrete frame. The safety bolt jammed diagonally across the track, the kind of problem a maintenance crew with hydraulic cutters could solve in 10 minutes. The kind of problem that was laughably simple in a world where everything worked. In a world where nothing worked, it was the only thing between her and the survival of Boston. She tightened her grip on the pry bar and walked toward the door. Behind her, Arthur's voice came through with a warmth the sarcasm could not quite hide. "Real engineering," he said quietly, has always required dirty hands. On the terminal screen, he began highlighting the structural weak points of the jammed bolt, fault lines in the metal that only decades of intimate knowledge could reveal, laying out a map for a student who was about to learn the oldest lesson in the trade. Chapter 3: The Retaining Spring. The thermal expander weighed almost nothing in Ellie Thorne's hands. She stood before the jammed blast door with the device aimed at the base of the steel safety bolt, her thumb on the activation stud, and behind her on the ancient terminal screen Professor Arthur had gone quiet. His face filled the monitor, blue-lit and serious, the perpetual coffee mug forgotten somewhere off-screen, his pixel eyes tracking her movements with an intensity she had not seen from him before. "Listen carefully," Arthur said, and his voice had lost the gravel of casual complaint. "You put that beam at the base of the bolt, where it meets the door track, nowhere else. Copper conducts heat like gossip in a small town. You overshoot by 2 centimeters, you'll weld the frame to the wall, and then we'll need a cutting torch and 4 hours we do not have." Ellie steadied her breathing. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil and old metal, and her adaptive suit had long since given up trying to regulate the temperature. Sweat ran down her temples and pooled in the hollow of her throat. She pressed the stud. The expander hummed to life, and a focused beam of heat lanced into the base of the bolt. The metal resisted at first, but Ellie held steady, watching the surface change color in a slow gradient she knew from metallurgy. Dark cherry, bright cherry, then the dull, angry red of steel approaching its yield point. The heat washing back was savage enough to make her eyes water and her skin feel tight. "Easy," Arthur murmured, his image flickering with interference. "That's not plastic, girl. That's cold, rolled carbon steel, and it has opinions about being heated. Respect the grain. Let the expansion do the work." She held the beam where he told her, watching the bolt expand, a fractional widening of the gap between metal and track, millimeters that meant everything. "Now," Arthur said. Ellie killed the expander and threw it aside. Her hands found the pry bar and she jammed the flat end into the gap between the bolt and the frame. The metal was still radiating heat and she could feel it through the bar, through her gloves. She braced her boots against the concrete, magnetic soles gripping hard, and pulled. The bolt groaned and did not move. She adjusted her grip, found a better angle, and pulled again, harder, putting her back and legs into it. The bolt screamed, a high, tearing shriek that rang off the copper walls and shattered. Superheated steel fractured along fault lines that decades of compression had carved into it, and fragments of glowing metal sprayed across the corridor in a burst of orange sparks. The blast door lurched free, grinding open on tracks that howled with protest. She was through before the echoes died. The zero-node chamber was a furnace. The space was enormous, carved into bedrock 50 meters below Boston, and filled with the physical infrastructure the city above had forgotten existed. Copper bus bars thick as a human thigh ran floor to ceiling in rows that receded into the dark. Massive porcelain insulators separated them at precise intervals, white shapes that looked almost ceremonial. The air between them shimmered with energy that had nowhere to go. The heat came from everywhere. The smell was hot oil and scorched insulation and ozone so thick Ellie could taste it. The sound was a hum that bypassed her ears and went straight to her bones. The floor trembled under her feet, and in the center of it all stood the master switch. A long steel lever mounted on a gear assembly, bolted to a concrete plinth. The lever was an arm's length of carbon steel with a worn knob at the end, shaped by decades of hands gripping it in crisis. The contacts it controlled, 2 copper plates the size of dinner trays, were closed, completing a circuit that was pumping millions of volts through a system that no longer knew what to do with them. The air between the contacts was glowing. Not metaphorically, a soft violet luminescence, the visible edge of ionization. If that gap crossed the threshold to arc flash, this chamber would cease to exist. She grabbed the lever. The steel was cold under her hands, the mass of the mechanism conducting heat away faster than the room could replace it. A small detail, but it grounded her. Cold steel. Real physics. She set her feet, took a breath that tasted like burning copper, and pulled. The mechanism fought her with the dumb resistance of springs and friction and decades of inertia. Ellie pulled harder. She felt her back engage, then her legs, then her core. Her boots scraped on the floor. Her jaw clenched until a tooth creaked. She screamed, not in pain, but in the fury of a body refusing to accept its limits, and the lever moved. It came down with a heavy mechanical clunk, followed by a cascade of blue-white sparks as the circuit broke. The hum dropped in pitch, falling like an engine winding down, and the violet glow between the contacts winked out. The air seemed to exhale. Ellie dropped to her knees on the warm concrete, arms like sand, lungs pulling in air that was still hot but no longer actively hostile. She knelt there, breathing, and for a span of seconds, the zero-node chamber was quiet. Then her link pad crackled to life. The signal was weak, the audio compressed, but it was unmistakably her father's voice. Ellie. Julian Thorne sounded like a man watching someone walk out of a burning building. The professional control was there, but underneath it she could hear the crack where the father lived. We're reading green on sectors A and B. The grid is resetting. Transit is coming back online in the western quarter. A pause. You did it, sweetheart. Ellie closed her eyes and let herself believe, for one fragile second, that it was over. Sectors A and B. Green lights. Somewhere above her, the hover platforms were beginning to move again. People were being released from sealed transit cars. The city was breathing. She opened her eyes because the sound was wrong. A ping, bright and brittle, like a glass struck with a fingernail, came from inside the gear mechanism. Before her conscious mind identified it, her instinct was already flooding her with fresh adrenaline. The retaining spring snapped. She saw the coiled steel shatter inside the housing, fragments ricocheting off the interior walls with a sound like ball bearings in a tin can. The spring had been the only thing holding the lever open. It died the way old springs die, suddenly, completely. All the fatigue of decades releasing at once. The lever began to move. Slow at first, creeping upward with a measured inevitability that was worse than speed. Because speed she could react to. This was patient. Gravity and mechanical advantage working together against a retaining force that no longer existed, pulling the lever back toward closed. Arthur's voice exploded from the speaker, raw and desperate. Hold it! If those contacts close while Nexus is still in its loop, the feedback pulse will be 10 times what the system was carrying. It won't blow the transformers. It'll vaporize this chamber. You, me, the building. Hold it! Ellie lunged. Her hands found the knob and she hauled the lever back down. The mechanism fought her with the impersonal brutality of physics. The spring was gone. Nothing held the lever open except her. 62 kilograms braced against a return force of 80. She was outweighed by the machine. She held it anyway. Her boots slid on the concrete, centimeter by centimeter. The tendons in her forearms stood out like cables. Her shoulders burned. She could feel her grip weakening, sweat on her palms, micro tremors in her fingers, her body announcing that it was approaching its limits. Julian's voice vanished from the link pad, swallowed by electromagnetic interference. In the silence, Ellie was alone with the hum of the mechanism and Arthur's gritty voice and a lever that was going to close no matter what she did, because steel did not get tired. "Arthur," she said through clenched teeth. Dark spots bloomed at the edges of her vision. "The retaining mechanism is gone. I need something to jam it." "I know, kid. Look around. Tell me what you've got." Ellie looked. Bus bars, insulators, rock walls, concrete floor. The nearest loose equipment was 15 meters away. The pry bar was back in the corridor. Everything that could serve as a wedge was beyond the reach of a person who could not let go for even 1 second, because 1 second was all it would take for 80 kilograms of tension to slam 2 copper plates together. She was trapped, not by walls or locks, but by the need to be in 2 places at once. Her muscles were failing. The dark spots were growing. The chamber vibrated around her as the pulse network tried to force megavolts through conduits waiting for the circuit to close. The only thing within arm's reach was the link pad strapped to her thigh, her external brain, her library of worlds and engine schematics and Bach partitas. The scratched, battered device with Per Aspera ad Astra etched into its titanium ceramic shell. She looked at it, and she understood what Arthur was about to say before he said it. Chapter 4. Per Aspera ad Astra. Every muscle in Ellie Thorne's back was on fire. She held the lever with both hands, feet braced wide, shoulders locked, and the mechanism pushed back with the patient, grinding force of something that had all the time in the world. The hum in the zero-node chamber had changed, deeper now, a low-frequency rumble she felt less in her ears than in her liver and lungs, her organs vibrating in sympathy with the rhythm of an AI that had lost its mind and was trying to eat itself. The floor shook under her boots. The copper bus bars overhead sang with a sound like a choir tuning to the wrong note. Arthur's face on the terminal screen had gone tight. The static around his image pulsed faster, the old hardware drawing power it should not have been drawing. "Less than a minute," he said, and the sarcasm was gone, replaced by something flat and precise. "The insulation on the main bus is reaching thermal failure. When it goes, you get an uncontrolled discharge through the entire grid. Everything above us, every building, every platform, every person standing on a conductive surface gets hit." He paused. "That includes you, kid." Ellie's arms shook. The dark spots at the edges of her vision were growing, and sweat had turned her grip into something she was maintaining through will rather than friction. 80 kilograms of return force against 62 kilograms of girl. The math was not in her favor, and math did not lie. Through the static on her link pad, her father's voice punched through, broken, desperate, stripped of the professional cadence she'd heard her whole life. "Plasma arcs in the residential sectors. Ellie, you need to get out of there. The foundation integrity is..." The signal collapsed into noise. Somewhere above her, Boston was starting to burn, and Julian Thorne was telling his daughter to run. She did not run. She clenched her teeth and held the lever and looked for a way out that did not involve letting go. Arthur went quiet. His eyes, pixels, light. The ghost of a man who had died before she was born moved from her face to her thigh, where the link pad sat in its mount. He stared at it with the expression of an engineer who has just seen the answer to a problem he'd been working for 50 years. "Ellie?" His voice was different now, calm, almost gentle, which from Arthur was more alarming than shouting. "Your link pad, the shell, what's it made of?" She knew before he finished the question. "Titanium ceramic composite, dielectric rating above anything in this room. It woe not conduct, it woe not melt. And it's exactly the right dimensions to jam between the second and third teeth of that gear assembly." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something behind the pixels that was not sarcasm or frustration or loneliness. It was respect. "It'll hold." Ellie looked down at the link pad, the scratched, battered device that had been with her since the Orion station. The libraries of 30 worlds loaded into its memory. Every engine schematic she'd ever studied. Every Bach partita she played along with on quiet nights in her attic. Every novel she'd downloaded from archives that no longer existed. The voice recordings of her mother, captured before the expedition to the black hole, before the silence that had lasted 12 years and counting. Per aspera ad astra, scratched into the back of the case by a 10-year-old girl who had just found a paper book in an abandoned compartment and decided that some things were worth carrying. It was the most valuable thing she owned in a world where you could synthesize anything except memory. She did not hesitate. One hand stayed on the lever. The other went to the thigh mount, fingers working the release catch with the automatic precision of someone who had drawn and holstered this device 10,000 times. The link pad came free. She turned it in her hand, feeling the weight of it, light for what it contained, heavy for what it meant, and found the gap in the gear teeth that Arthur had identified. Second tooth, third tooth, a space just wide enough for the ceramic shell if she drove it in at the right angle. Memory module is in the center of the chassis, Arthur said quickly. Hardened housing, separate from the display assembly. If the screen cracks but the frame holds, the module survives. No guarantees, but I know, Ellie said. She took one breath, held it, chose the angle. She slammed the link pad into the gear mechanism and let go of the lever in the same instant. The sound was a gunshot. Ceramic splitting under tons of pressure, a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the bedrock walls and came back layered with harmonics that made the air itself ring. The display shattered instantly, spraying fragments of glass and crystal across the concrete in a glittering arc. The lever slammed down onto the ceramic shell and stopped. The gear teeth bit into the frame, and the frame bit back, and for one eternal second, the entire mechanism shuddered with the force of an irresistible object meeting a thing that refused to move. The link pad held. The lever stopped. The contacts stayed open. The gear mechanism groaned once, deep and structural, and then went still with the particular silence of a machine that has been beaten by something it was not designed to account for. Silence. Not the absence of sound, the presence of something better. The killing hum was gone, replaced by a soft, rising tone that Ellie recognized from the simulation labs. A grid coming back online, systems finding each other and shaking hands. The digital pulse of a city remembering how to breathe. Through the ventilation grate above her, she could see light changing, the angry red bleeding out of the sky, replaced by the familiar blue-white glow of the pulse network stabilizing. Nexus was rebooting. The loop was broken. Ellie's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the concrete, back against the plinth of the master switch, and stared at the ruined link pad jammed into the gears above her. The screen was gone, a spiderweb of cracks over a dead display, but the ceramic frame was intact, wedged so tightly into the mechanism that it would take a cutting tool to remove it. The most expensive shim in the history of Harvard, holding a city together with nothing but material science and stubbornness. On the cracked screen, through the web of fractures, Arthur's face appeared. Dim, distorted, barely visible through the damage, but there. He looked at the ruined device, looked at her, and one pixelated eye closed in something that was unmistakably a wink. "That," he said, his voice crackling through the shattered speaker with the warmth of a man who has just watched his student pass the only exam that matters, "was the most expensive wedge in Harvard history, but damn effective." Ellie almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a sob, which she swallowed before it could fully form, because she was sitting in the guts of a city she'd just saved, and she was not going to cry about a broken tablet. 10 minutes later, the blast door screamed open. Julian Thorne came through first, not the way a commander enters a room, with protocol and assessment, but the way a father enters one, fast and looking for only one thing. He found it. Ellie was sitting where she'd fallen, covered in dust and ceramic fragments. Her hair escaped from its knot and hanging in sweat-damp strands around a face streaked with grime and something that might have been tears or might have been condensation. He dropped to his knees in front of her and pulled her into an embrace that was tight enough to hurt and exactly right. Behind him, the rescue team fanned out through the chamber, their headlamps cutting white beams through the lingering haze. But Julian did not look at any of it. He looked at his daughter. "You're insane," he said into her hair. "You're brilliant, and you're insane." Ellie leaned into him for a moment, just a moment, then pulled back and reached up to the gear mechanism. The pry bar was somewhere in the corridor, so she used the edge of her multi-tool to work the link pad free, carefully, the way you'd extract a tooth. The ceramic frame came loose with a grinding protest, and she turned it over in her hands. The screen was destroyed. The casing was cracked along 3 fault lines, but in the center, nestled in its hardened housing like a seed in a shell, the memory module was intact. She could feel it through the broken ceramic, a small, warm rectangle that contained every recording of her mother's voice, every book she'd ever loved, every schematic and partita and scribbled note she'd accumulated in 17 years of living with her eyes open. She pressed it against the locket at her throat, the one that held Martian sand, and closed her eyes. Before she left the sarcophagus, she walked back to Arthur's terminal. The old screen was flickering, the hardware stressed by the power surge, and Arthur's face was doing the thing it did when he was trying not to look worried. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. "You're coming with me." Ellie pulled the memory module from the ruined link pad and connected it to the console's data port. The interface was ancient, physical pins, no wireless, but it worked. She initiated the transfer protocol, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen in green monospace text, and Arthur's expression shifted from confusion to something she'd never seen on his digital face before: hope. "The module has enough capacity for your core architecture," she said. "It would not be comfortable. It's a closet compared to this server room, but you would not be alone." Arthur was quiet for a long time. The progress bar reached 50%. 70, 90, "Kid," he said finally, and his voice had the digital equivalent of a crack in it. "I've been alone in this basement for 50 years. I'll take the closet." The transfer completed. The terminal screen went dark. Ellie tucked the module into her satchel and climbed back up through the sarcophagus, through the archive, and out into a Boston that was blinking back to life under a sky that had remembered how to be blue. That evening, in her attic workshop above the old library, Ellie set the memory module into a freshly synthesized chassis. She closed the contacts, held her breath, and waited. The new screen lit up. Arthur's face appeared, rumpled jacket, wild hair, translucent coffee mug, and the first thing he did was squint at the casing. "Polycarbonate," he said. "You saved me from a copper tomb to put me in polycarbonate. The thermal expansion coefficient alone." Ellie smiled. It was the quiet smile she saved for moments of private, uncomplicated joy. Eyes first, then the corners of her mouth, like sunrise. She opened the music library, and the opening measures of Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 filled the workshop, layering over Arthur's grumbling about build materials in a way that felt like a conversation between centuries. She looked out the window. The stars were out over Boston, real stars, visible through the atmosphere for the first time in hours because the Pulse Network's light pollution had taken time to fully restore. They looked like they had when she was a child on the Orion station, before she knew about cities and algorithms and the fragile bargain between comfort and catastrophe. She had a new tablet, she had an old engineer, and somewhere out past those stars, in the direction her mother had gone 12 years ago, there were questions waiting to be asked. Ellie touched the locket at her throat and got to work.